What are peatlands? Also known as bogs, mires, moors and fens, peatlands are composed of a mass of pickled plant matter, peat. The plant matter is suspended in its path towards decomposition by a lack of oxygen and the acidity of the surrounding stagnant water. Although peatlands make up only 3% of the world's landmass, they have a huge impact on the global climate. Because peatlands prevent plant matter from decomposing, they are the largest terrestrial carbon store, storing more than double the carbon of all the world's forests combined. Also, peatlands host a plethora of weird and wonderful life, including the insect-eating sundew and the infamous sphagnum moss, peat moss, the most abundant plant in peatlands. Yet, when drained, peatlands also pose a number of threats. To name a few, they can exacerbate flooding and pollute local water with the runoff. They can become highly flammable and also cause land subsidence. Drainage also turns the land from a carbon sink to a very potent carbon emitter. Currently, drained peatlands are emitting roughly 5% of all anthropogenic carbon dioxide.
Dear policymakers, we, as artists, have devoted the last 4 years to researching, promoting, and exploring creative ways through which we can come closer to the more than human, with a focus on recognizing and venerating biodiversity in ancient ecosystems, including peatlands. Much of our projects are informed by scientific facts, but we are not scientists or peat experts. We often base our projects on our deep-rooted relationship to the environment, and it is from this instinctive, personal point of view that we are reaching out to you as policymakers. It is of common knowledge that peatlands are the largest natural terrestrial carbon store, but why are they often unnoticed and so poorly valued? We also believe as a collective that peatlands play a key role in shielding our memories. To look at peatlands is to take a glimpse into the past and the future.
Many of our projects incorporate these memories, and as a result, we are expressing real concern for the loss of our precious peatlands in storing these unique stories and narratives. We are on the edge of ecological collapse, and we simply ask you to use your power to protect not only our collective memory, but also this unique habitat, which quietly does so much to protect and compensate for our actions. It's very simple. By increasing the subsidies towards protecting these ancient ecosystems, we can really begin to tackle this ecological crisis. There's only so much we as individuals can do, but as policymakers, you are capable of actioning so much more. We hope you listen to our appeals to help preserve the peatlands. For us, the planet and our future. Finn Archibald, Anna Lopez, Maria Slitmer, Lucy Watkins. A&E, Scotland.
Peatlands are a precious and valuable ecosystem that deserve far greater protection and appreciation. But how can we persuade people to take greater care of them? As a geographer and former climate change advisor, I used to believe the answer lay in sharing knowledge and evidence. If only we could persuade people how important peatlands were for carbon storage, biodiversity and flood protection, then surely they would want to look after them. Well, we've already had plenty of compelling evidence-based reports. What we really need is a rapid change of heart. This is why I've switched my focus away from communicating the latest scientific advice towards encouraging people to simply slow down, notice, and enjoy nature's beauty and colour. I'm convinced that when you help people see our beautiful peatlands with fresh eyes, they start to love, appreciate, and take care of them. After all, it's not carbon storage, however important, that makes someone care about peatlands. It's the joyful sight of dancing cotton grass, the mesmerising pattern of sphagnum moss stars, the stripy orange bottom of a bilberry bumblebee. We all respond to the beauty and these tiny moments of joy. Indeed, recent research has found beauty, wonder, and meaning are powerful pathways to nature connection, which is closely correlated with pro-environmental behavior. As the writer Robert Macfarlane once said, "We will not save what we do not love, and we rarely love what we cannot name or do not see." So what about you? One of the easiest and most effective ways to see beauty and experience the wonder of the peatland environment is to simply try and sketch it. The process of sketching, however wobbly your lines, changes the way you see your surroundings, revealing beauty and wonder you'd never noticed before. Anyone can do it. It doesn't take long and requires no artistic talent or knowledge of peatland ecology. The quality of your sketch is irrelevant. It's the process of slowing down and looking really carefully that matters and changes how you feel. It's the observation, not the drawing, that strengthens your connection and relationship to nature. Why not put down your phone, pick up a pencil and have a go? I guarantee the more you look, the more you'll see. This is a piece from Dr. Ali Foxon, who is the founder of Boggy Doodles, helping people of all ages use green sketching to see, enjoy, and connect with nature. Find out more on the website or follow the Instagram with the handle Boggy Doodles. And 3 little tips to help you start green sketching. The first, don't worry about whether or not you can draw. Enjoy the process of slowing down and noticing amazing details you'd otherwise miss. Start small. Build your confidence with little sketches of things. Focus on joy. Try to find details, colors, and patterns that make you smile.
I'm Rachel, Project Coordinator at Cryptic, a producing art house based in Glasgow, Scotland. Below the Blanket was a series of new artworks installed throughout the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, inspired by one of Scotland's most extraordinary unsung natural features, the Flow Country. It's the world's largest blanket bog, a vast mass of peat and sphagnum moss shot through with hundreds of lochs, covering over 200,000 hectares in Caithness and Sutherland. Artists including Cathy Hind, Lucy Holland, Heather Lander and Matthew Olden made work responding to this landscape's wildlife and soundscape, the gradual process of peat formation, and even the way the blanket bog breathes as it expands and contracts. Throughout the Flow Country, vast parts of the peatland bog breathe differently depending on the rise and fall of the water levels and the health of the peat and the moss. Using data gathered over 18 months in the Flow Country, composer Lucy Holland's release lets us hear these variations over time as we make our way through the maze. Each area studied has been interpreted as a different percussion track, whose rhythm alters according to the changes in water levels recorded there. These voices follow us through the maze, reminding us of the complex interplay between human and environmental factors which shape every natural landscape. Look carefully at the flowers and plants on either side of this path. Strangely shaped speakers have sprung up, resembling the bogbean plants that grow in peat bogs. From them come Cathy Hind's deep listening soundscapes, compositions based around sounds recorded below the surface of the Flow Country by submerged microphones called hydrophones. The speakers form a path leading to water balance, a kinetic sound sculpture in a pond. Vessels fill up with flowing water until they overturn and spill into gongs, generating a shimmering, living composition inspired by the waterlogged conditions necessary to sustain the peat bog. Emerging on the pathway from the pond, soundscapes generated from sonifying the strong winds of the Flow Country create haunting aeolian melodies and pulsing rhythms, swirling around the walkway from multiple speakers. Below the Blanket was produced by Cryptic as part of the Peatland Partnership's Flows to the Future project.
Not long ago, my grandparents cut the peat. They spent a lot of time out there, knowing and unknowing the land intimately as they reorganized the shape of the peat. Layers to stacks, layers to stacks. It was cold in Ireland, and the warmth provided by the peat briquettes was necessary for comfort and survival. Over time, this necessity became a tradition. Meanwhile, my upbringing took place half a world away. Familial ties to this ancestral parcel of land were weakened. Discovering the ecological and cultural importance of peatlands strengthened my ties to this land and to my family. Only now the storyline has changed. Not only do we find ourselves in the midst of a climate crisis, but the industrial peat cutting has severed the first-hand relationship with the peat regardless. Our ancestors cut peat for warmth, and now we must conserve peat to prevent warmth. Our ancestors looked out for their survival, and now we must look out for ours. To respect the traditions and memory of our ancestors, we must change our traditions, and we must make new traditions. It is necessary for our survival.
Essere giovani in questo mondo è un'impresa alquanto difficile. Tante responsabilità ereditate dal comportamento di generazioni precedenti, poco preoccupate ad assicurare una stabilità globale ecologica e sociale. Ci troviamo pur non volendo a farci carico di un mondo futuro instabile. Un mondo in cui dobbiamo far fronte all'alzamento delle temperature, allo scioglimento dei ghiacci, all'innalzamento degli oceani, per non parlare alla desertificazione sempre in espansione e all'inaridimento sempre maggiore del suolo. Sono queste solo alcune fra le tante conseguenze attuali e future del cambiamento climatico. Siamo dunque una generazione che deve affrontare gli effetti collaterali di un sistema non sostenibile, basato su un modello di sviluppo capitalista, consumista, iniquo e sfruttatore. Ma cosa c'entra la torba con tutto ciò? Partiamo dal presupposto, purtroppo non sempre scontato, di una indiscutibile realtà attuale di crisi climatica di origine antropogenica, comprovata dagli scienziati ambientali con un consenso del 98%. Consideriamo inoltre che le torbiere, quando integre, svolgono un'importante funzione di mitigazione del cambiamento climatico, in quanto sono dissipatori di carbonio, purificatori naturali di acqua, barriere naturali anti-inondazione e fonti di biodiversità sia animale che vegetale. Mentre, quando prosciugate o distrutte, sono fonte di emissioni di CO2 3 volte maggiori quelle dell'industria aerea, valore corrispondente al 5% delle emissioni di CO2 antropogeniche globali. Infine, considerando che, in seguito all'accordo di Parigi del 2015 e all'adozione dall'ottobre 2014 del quadro 2030 per il clima e l'energia da parte del Consiglio europeo, i governi dell'Unione Europea si sono impegnati a ridurre le proprie emissioni del 40% entro il 2030 e a raggiungere la neutralità climatica entro il 2050. È perciò evidente che, in tale contesto, la protezione e il ripristino delle torbiere diventi un modo pratico, efficiente ed efficace per far fronte a un problema estremamente complesso e difficile da affrontare. Dunque, come giovane, parlando a nome di tutte quelle generazioni future, di tutti coloro che credono e lottano per la possibilità di un mondo vivibile e un mondo ecologicamente stabile, chiedo ai leader europei di non farsi sfuggire una grande occasione per fare la differenza e dunque di formulare una politica agricola comune più sostenibile partendo dalla protezione e il restauro delle torbiere europee. Chiedo anche di investire nella ricerca di pratiche tecniche di agricoltura alternativa e di quelle di drenaggio, come ad esempio la paludicoltura, e di incentivare con sussidi gli agricoltori a dirigersi verso tali pratiche più sostenibili. Insomma, questo argomento di cui se ne parla ben poco costituisce una soluzione reale e a lungo termine, e dunque dovrebbe essere riconosciuto come tale e datogli il giusto peso e valore nella politica sia nazionale che europea, nella speranza di un futuro più stabile per me e i miei figli. Carolina Maienza.
Dr. Catherine Farrell is a restoration ecologist who has worked on a wide range of projects in Ireland to restore degraded peatlands. She has worked on industrial and domestically cut peatlands, as well as expanding her work internationally to develop best practices globally for peatland restoration. Presently, Catherine is a research fellow in Trinity College Dublin, working on the InCase, Irish Natural Capital Accounting for Sustainable Environments project. Catherine is a founding member of the Irish Forum on Natural Capital and is an active member of the Community Wetlands Forum in Ireland. She's passionate about nature and especially peatlands.
What is your background with peatlands and what brought you to peatlands professionally?
I've always been an outdoors person. I grew up on a farm in the middle of Ireland and loved working with the land and nature basically. Okay, stop. Just ask her.
What is your background with peatlands and what brought you to peatlands professionally?
I've always been an outdoors person. I grew up on a farm in the middle of Ireland and loved working with land and nature basically. When I studied ecology in university in the mid-1990s, I spotted an advert for a PhD on restoring blanket bogs in NW Mayo. The rest is history, as they say. I spent a decade in the west of Ireland learning how peatlands work, how they respond to drainage and cutting, and then I figured out how best to restore them. After that formative time, I came back to the Midlands and expanded my experience onto degraded raised bogs. I've been lucky to travel to a range of peatland countries in the Northern Hemisphere, and some of my best friends are peat people.
Perhaps you can also explain a little about the value of peatlands, both in a personal or cultural sense, but also in an economic service sense.
There's something about big landscapes, and in the west of Ireland, those big landscapes are blanketed by peatlands. They've inspired poets and artists and scientists alike to create great works of art and meticulous study. Being in the wide open space where sky, earth and water meet in a sphagnum pool is unparalleled and precious. But not only these cultural services, this sense of connection with nature are given by peatlands for our experience and enrichment. Peatlands provide a range of regulatory ecosystem services. Intact peatlands regulate water flow and quality. They take carbon from the air and lock it in the earth for lifetimes, and they sustain a vibrant diversity of species and habitats.
You've worked a lot with restoration of peatlands and bogs. How do you feel about how that has gone over the past number of years? Has there been a cultural shift in Ireland, in your eyes?
Good, because I also...
You've worked a lot with restoration of peatlands and bogs. How do you feel about how that has gone over the past number of years? Has there been a cultural shift in Ireland in your eyes regarding how people view peatlands?
When I started restoring bogs, there was some interest focused mainly on Clara Bog and a few raised bogs in the Midlands, but little work done elsewhere. Peatlands were viewed as wastelands, places to cut turf, places to dump rubbish or stick wind turbines that needed big spaces far from human settlement. Now it seems, I hope, that people across Ireland and the world are taking up to the hidden values of peatlands. There are a lot more projects and quite a few lessons being learned by the wider scientific and equally by the local communities. With the new EU biodiversity strategy, 2030 targets on restoration and the UN decade of restoration starting in 2021, we need to ensure the funding and work is focused on the right actions and outcomes for each bog. Every bog is different and therefore needs a tailored restoration plan. That plan can't be developed in isolation by agencies, and local communities must be part of the story and the restoration.
What is your vision of the future of peatlands?
My vision is a future of healthy, vibrant peatlands alongside an integrated network of freshwater, woodland, grassland, cropland, coastal, upland and marine ecosystems. This equates to a healthy environment for people to live in, settlements areas within the tapestry of natural systems. I call this the symphony of ecosystems. Peatlands are integral to this symphony, and instead of being the Cinderella ecosystem, they be respected and realized for their beauty and silent natural wisdom.
I know you also work with and co-founded the Irish Forum on Natural Capital. What do you feel is the role of business and finance in realizing peatland restoration? Do you see peatlands as providing economic potential? And if so, in what ways or uses of the ecosystem? How heavily do the agriculture system and farmers feature in the realization?
Business can play a central role in restoring the peatlands. Providing the necessary finance or other support enables the design and planning of restoration by peatland ecologists / practitioners. Bringing business, ecology and community together makes a shared platform where all interests can share the experience and learn from each other. Of course, learning new ways of working together is not always easy. We must find a common language. That is part of the natural capital approach, and this is where I see the value in natural capital accounting and assessments. These tools facilitate an entry point from the business side to nature in a way. We'll all learn from this meeting of minds. In terms of the economic potential of peatland restoration, just look at the number of homes in a catchment that can be spared flooding through holding water and restored bogs. What price would we put on significantly reducing carbon emissions by getting carbon back into the bogs? Does everything have to have a price tag for it to matter? I don't believe so, but often this is the only metric available for policymakers. We need to bring other values to the fore, and these include the value of the ecosystem services for which there are no markets presently. Farmers are business people. They are also the custodians of most of the land in Ireland, so they are in a unique role. How can we restore peatlands without their support and help? This is the challenge of CAP. This calls for informed and wise decisions around payment schemes through CAP for those who work with their lands and in particular their peatlands to enhance the flow of vital ecosystem services for the wider local and global community.
Do you see that widespread peatland restoration can be achieved in such a way, economic viability, or do you feel we need more fundamental societal changes in order to do so?
Restoration is ecological, but also demands societal buy-in and economic supports to do the work. Building capacity within the existing network of farmers, landowners, communities and interest groups will get the work done. Irish communities are hard-working and creative. They understand the inherent value of nature, but the funding and governance structures must be put in place to enable and allow them to do it effectively and efficiently. This can be provided from the top. So the change must come from the top for the work to be realized on the ground. Whether this is achieved through payments for ecosystem services or achieved because it is simply the right thing to do will be determined by society.
What would you like to say to the EU policymakers before the upcoming What would you like to say to the EU policymakers before the upcoming Common Agricultural Policy decision?
Peatlands are vital systems. They must be brought front and centre in any discussion around payment schemes through the EU CAP on how to realise their true inherent value and contributions on economic, environment and social levels. In Ireland, peatlands are one of the dominant ecosystems in the rural landscape. We can reverse centuries of ecological degradation by restoring them, and in so doing, we can support and sustain vibrant rural communities, realise climate and biodiversity targets, and make our waters healthy again. Restoring peatlands rewards societies and economies with multiple benefits. Equally, continuing to allow them to degrade by not restoring them leads to a plethora of harmful disbenefits. Which outcome do you want? The power is in your hands.
After devouring the conservation revolution, watching Bram Bush's interview with Verso Books, and finding ourselves critically engaging in these topics with our own work, we knew we had to sit down with the authors and talk some more. Robert Fletcher joined us for a fascinating and resonating interview. The interview was transcribed in the text I'll read shortly, and was visualized in the poster you see us creating on the screen. We started the interview aware that we were coming from similar perspectives. Bram and Robert refer to the changes we all deem necessary as a revolution. We talk about a paradigm shift. All of us aware that the way we talk about, deal with, interact with, and imagine the landscapes around us needs to change. Two things were notable off the bat about the way Bram and Robert were interacting with these issues. Firstly, throughout the interview and the book, Bram and Robert go to the root of the issue, challenging long-standing and deep-seated perceptions about conservation. Secondly, they situate conservation along various other concepts and realities that it interacts with. For example, they draw attention to the way capitalism and conservation connect and reinforce one another. These two leading themes also connect to one another in various ways. An example of this is the human-nature dichotomy that is a key ingredient in the capitalist system. The way by which mainstream conservationists currently position themselves towards the non-human world is counterproductive for two main reasons. By isolating ourselves from the non-human world and putting a fence around it, the strong dichotomy between humans and nature is reinforced. This stands in the way of humans actually connecting with and being part of what is often called quote-unquote nature. Secondly, there are strong capitalist assumptions that mainstream conservation relies on. This is paradoxical, as capitalism is inherently unsustainable and actually one of the main drivers of our ecological crisis. The radical proposal that Bram and Rob posed to redirect conservation efforts is convivial conservation. It's an interactive way for the human and non-human world to live together. It goes beyond the strict distinctions between human and nature and requires us to have our behaviour towards nature not be driven by capitalist interest, but rather rooted in care. Bringing convivial conservation into reality requires us to critically challenge and reimagine interactions between the human and non-human world. It should no longer be dependent on utilitarian principles that instrumentalize nature for societal development, but transform into a symbiosis. While the conservation revolution is rooted in global theory, the ideas that we developed with RE-PEAT have emerged from observations at a smaller scale. With peatlands as a microcosm for global conservation tendencies, we have come to realize peatland conservation requires human involvement. Humans have had a long history of interacting with peat in a large variety of ways. Through industrialization, many of these customs have been lost and forgotten. We need to reimagine our relationship to peatlands and find a way to live together. Drained peatlands must be re-wetted, and agricultural forms such as paludiculture are an interesting example of the human and non-human world operating in a symbiosis.
I wrote this letter back on the 26th of April, and today it's the 15th of October. And so much about the world has transformed in that short space of time. So we know that we can make amazing, extraordinary decisions if we want to. To whom it may concern, I'm writing in three capacities today. Firstly, on behalf of my daughter, Frances Turk, who's transformed my thinking as a busy professional and active citizen over the last few years. She's become, through her choices and actions, an intelligent, thoughtful, and peaceful advocate for the non-human world, and for the possibility of all humans making better choices in their relationships with nature and the ecosystems that support us. More recently, with a small group of friends and colleagues, she's focused her attention on the subject of peat bogs and wetlands and their ecological importance to the temperate ecosystems crucial to the healthy future of European nations. Her quiet and conscientious testimony and activism has focused my attention on this little understood subject, and my consciousness and empathy has increased exponentially as a result of her teaching. I now regularly advocate in my public as well as private life for the appreciation and reverence of one of our most precious resources and the illogical climate injustice of laws that allow, indeed encourage, the exploitation of these magical and vital carbon sinks for animal farming and agriculture. Secondly, I'm writing to you as the director of the House of Fairy Tales, a young person's arts charity based in the UK. We're currently developing The Great Imagining, which is a cultural education programme for schools that aims to set alight the imagination of young people and inspire them to create a better future for themselves, their communities, and their planet. We also aim to empower critical thinking to ensure that young people have access to the separating fact from fiction and to unpack and investigate and interrogate the belief systems of their parents, their communities, and their nations, to ensure that they can build their own belief systems on values that they themselves have grounded in facts and information. The mission is to empower young people and their communities to be able to create a kinder, greener, fairer world for themselves and for future generations. This programme is directly addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.7, which I'm sure you all know really well. By 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the skills and knowledge needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of culture and peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. We will be covering wetlands as part of this programme and would really love to report to the young people of the UK and Europe that in 2020, during the global pandemic, the MEPs and decision makers of Europe made strong steps towards protecting this heritage and preventing the devastation caused by draining these ancient lands and releasing vast tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that they did that by offering financial and practical incentives towards the farmers that are already getting their livelihoods from these lands to change their thinking and their practice onto a sustainable and ethical path. Finally, on a personal level, I'm absolutely horrified and terrified for the future, as I'm horrified by the profligacy of our species, especially the speed of devastation and exponential self-harm being done by big business, industry and agricultural practices allowed by our international laws, as was witnessed and carefully and conscientiously backed up by the majority of the world's climate scientists in the IPCC report of 2018. We don't have long to turn away from this suicidal pathway. It will take a massive transformation of all our political systems, as well as to capture the imaginations of the mainstream populace throughout the planet to make this happen. Now, in the midst of a global pandemic, we can get a glimpse of what might be possible if we cared as much about the future of our species as we do about the present circumstances. So with all my heart, I beg you to look at this very important subject of our wetlands and hear what these young people have to say, so that you can bring this knowledge to your colleagues and draft the laws which will protect these ancient lands, which protect us as much as you are investing in the food to feed us, and others are currently investing in the vaccines and the lockdown laws to protect us from a tiny virus. I look forward to hearing good news on this subject coming back from the imminent Common Agricultural Policy conferences this year. Yours in passion for the future of our next generation, as well as our wetlands. Deborah Curtis. Thank you.
What are the ecological and educational futures of peatlands? Dr. Derek Gladwin, University of British Columbia. I write to you as an educator and researcher of environmental literacy and sustainability education at the University of British Columbia in Canada. My initial aim here is to briefly overview how peatland education is essential to building sustainable futures around the world and how these futures are more urgent than ever. The second goal is to emphasise how important European policy decisions about peatlands are for the rest of the world, particularly when envisioning sustainable futures. Peatlands are vital wetland ecosystems around the planet, covering approximately 400 to 500 million hectares of the world's surface, about 8%, though largely found in northern latitudes such as Europe and North America. Peatlands are as significant to the Earth's landmass as are tropical rainforests or deserts in terms of surface area. Peatlands are a particularly important issue at the moment because of their capacity to reduce global climate change. They act as carbon sequestration units, or sinks, which are places where carbon dioxide is captured from the atmosphere. In fact, 20% of the world's terrestrial carbon is captured and stored in peatlands located in the Northern Hemisphere. This is why the destruction of peatlands, through mismanagement, urban development, agricultural expansion, or peat extraction for fuel, accelerates global climate change. Removing peatlands not only reduces the land masses where carbon can be captured and stored, but it also releases stored carbon for several millennia back into the atmosphere. It's an exponential problem related to the Earth's ecological future. If peatlands widely benefit all species and organisms on the Earth, including but not limited to humans, then why are they continually neglected or relegated for development or reclamation? In Europe, for example, 90% of wetlands, mostly consisting of peatland, have been destroyed. Much like the rapidly melting glaciers on the poles of the Earth, peatlands are a barometer for a healthy planet, both past and future. Changing the ecological futures of peatlands directly relates to altering the ways in which people perceive and value them. Understanding and addressing this issue is an interdisciplinary and intercultural process, unifying a range of frameworks beyond limited disciplinary or cultural perspectives. Imagining and then acting on peatland futures is collective and multifaceted and remains a significant issue of education and literacy. But a significant outcome of promoting interdisciplinary education about peatlands comes from governments and how laws and policies are constructed and then implemented. This is why I am contributing to this anthology aimed at members of European Parliament before the upcoming Common Agricultural Policy meetings. Expanding peatland literacy is much more than an educational enterprise. It also propels public discourse and action about the Earth's ecological futures, which directly relate to the decisions we make as a global collective about peatlands. Mobilising change and motivating behavioural shifts emerge from socio-political influence. In order to reduce climate change, we must first address cultural and social change. A huge part of that change involves demonstrating what we value throughout making policy decisions that reflect collective and sustainable values. In other words, the ecological futures of peatlands coincide with our socio-political futures. The American environmental activist and best-selling author Bill McKibben argues, the real fight, all real fights, are over the zeitgeist. They're about who controls the vision of the future. How will Europe decide the future of peatlands, and how will this vision coincide with values and attitudes that support building sustainable futures?
To whom this may concern. My name is Elise Alley Ferm, and I'm from France and the US. I currently lead a network called Youth Engaged in Wetlands, an international volunteer-run youth group dedicated to the conservation and wise use of wetlands. I have a background in environmental science and integrated water management, and I have been interested in wetlands ever since I joined the Ramsar Convention Secretariat in 2014, and it has been my passion from that moment forward. I am personally fascinated by peatlands. I find that there is a certain mystery around them. They have this silent power capturing carbon from the atmosphere. They are also critically important for storing large quantities of water and hosting great biological diversity. The slow processes can take place within the peatland ecosystems, allows them to capture enormous amounts of carbon over thousands of years. This great ability to trap greenhouse gases, however, can only be secured if they are undistributed. This great power can also be reversed as peatlands are drained, exploited or converted to different land uses, releasing back to the atmosphere the greenhouse gases that they have so carefully guarded for thousands of years. I remember the first time I visited a peatland. I traveled to the Jura Mountains in France, to the Torbais Decises with some colleagues from the Ramsar Convention Secretariat. My boss at the time walked us around the peatland and introduced us to these amazing features. I remember seeing patches of this dark black soil soaked in water. I had never seen anything like it. The atmosphere was so calm and peaceful. While we were walking around the boardwalk, I just could imagine all the microscopic processes taking place below our feet, mesmerized by the fact that this beautiful and quiet landscape is one of the most powerful climate solutions that we have. And the key is to let it do its thing. I believe that the EU has an important responsibility to find ways to help farmers and landowners to preserve this natural heritage and to promote sustainable farming and integrated water management policies that protect peatlands. Protecting peatlands is a shared responsibility, and farmers can't take the burden all on their own. It's already hard enough to run a farm, and there should be ways to make it easier for the farmers to take care of their land and their livelihoods without impairing the very ecosystems that support us. I therefore call on you as decision makers to promote positive subsidies and incentives that don't hurt peatlands while working to take the pressure off small-scale farmers. Peatlands need your help. We need your help to make sure that these ecosystems can play a positive role in our fight against climate change, in our fight against biodiversity loss, and the development of thriving, sustainable communities. Thank you.
Little Loss. Sphagnum Gergensoni. Gergenson's Bog Moss. You are mostly dead. Your colourless hyaline cells fringed by little specks of the living. Small chlorophyllose cells, linked through your leaves like chainmail. Death bordered by life. Death bordered by life. Repeating relentlessly through the body. And we do hold dead things inside us. Things we have lost. People. Objects. Dreams that never crossed into life. Or saw enough light. Get carried in us everywhere we go. But your dead hyaline cells contain pores, retaining water. They enable you to access your environment. They are not redundant. So when we are told to move on from loss, I do not really understand it. If we carry our losses in us, they can be spaces that link us to the places we are in. They can be conduits for things that flow to move through us. Thought, warmth, laughter, song. We cannot stagnate where death is an opening. Little Peach, Sphagnum palustre, blunt-leaved bog moss. Baby's breath, lamb's bleat, little peach. Sleek of pulp and feet, cream, loud pealing of bells, dream. Pillows of plants gleam the grass together. Stitch. Branches tether leaves, no sleeves, a narrow. Taper. Candles breaking in the grass. Shrink of throat and heart won't pass. Your ditch-ripe cheeks, your pastel heat. Palustre is a marsh, but if you're classed by where you come from, you're the edge that meets the soften. You're the coughing of blossom giving way to wood. Woven leaves, no sleeves, a shallow. Pink is an afterthought. Peach is the leaf you brought. You're fleshy, soft and outer. You're hard and nutless butter. Nothing in that isn't soft. nothing out that isn't soft, nothing in that isn't soft, nothing out that isn't soft. Stitch a sunset using ditches, stitch a life using peaches, see it grow. In the marshes no one knows what patterns peak, little quilt of heat, fingertips dust sleep, palustre, palustre, creeps along the marrow, weaving pinks of mallow in the flushes, butter blushes.
On the screen are two images of soil profiles. Forest soil profile. The soil profile in image 1 is an example of how forest soil would look like. There are 5 distinct horizons with healthy topsoil formed from the organic matter, deposited in the null horizon, breaking down to form the humus layer or A horizon. This is significantly different from the image on the right. Desert soil profile. The soil profile in image 2 is an example of how desert soil looks like. This soil profile was extracted from the ICBA campus after a decade of rehabilitating the soil by adding various organic amendments to it. There appears to be 2 layers in this profile, however they are both from the same horizon C. The top layer is an artificial layer darkened due to the enrichment of the soil.
A letter addressed to a policymaker. I want you to understand that by the time I'm your age, by the time I'm old enough to be a policymaker, the world will be in one way or another very different, and that right now, I'm still young and I depend on you to direct that difference. I wonder if you have children of your own. I'm writing this letter because I'm concerned about the peatlands in Europe. But before I get onto that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in London, a place where profit pushes people around stations in suits, a place where normal life takes place with a backdrop of glass and concrete. One day I looked around and realised that my normal was quite literally built off abuse and destruction. It's quite an odd sensation to realise that everything I knew, everything that shaped me, somehow structured all wrong. I would stay up late at night thinking about the faraway forests that were getting chopped, the skies that are getting smogged, the oceans filled with plastic, the ice caps melting, the oil mined and the wetlands drained. I would think about the people I'd never even met who were suffering directly, and animals I didn't even know that were disappearing. That's why I started doing things like this, writing letters. Something else to keep me up at night. I'm not sure if you realise this, but in the current EU Common Agricultural Policy, farmers are incentivised to drain their peatlands. They're given subsidies if they do so. This drainage-based agriculture means that our precious peat soils are constantly eroding. The unique habitat that the peatlands once offered is no longer available for their distinctive plants and rare creatures. It means that the dried up peatlands are constantly emitting large amounts of CO2 which continually warm up the planet. Did you know that the CO2 emissions from drained peatlands accounts for more than twice the emissions of the aviation industry? It means that the nutrient-rich peat pollutes the local water and can kill fish, and that drinking water needs to be treated with extra chlorine. It means flood risk for local communities and land subsidence, and yet the EU, who supposedly cares so much about the environment, actively encourage drainage-based agriculture. To me, peatlands represent time itself. If you look closely at peat core, you'll see 1,000-year-old petals with the veins delicately protruding. You might find the body of your long-lost ancestor. A sample of ancient peat pollen can give you a glimpse into past climates and parallel worlds. Peatlands capture moments of our Earth history, as well as preserve the marks of ancient human civilizations. So to lose a peatland is somehow to erase time. It's important that you realise that the decision you make for this upcoming CAP will last a long time. The future of peatlands and the earth needs to be considered, because farmers cannot transition on their own. They need alternative subsidies and rewards for restoration. They need you to help them. Thank you for reading this, and I hope you take something from these words. Yours, Frankie Turk.
Het is zondagmorgen 9:30. We zijn op weg naar Klazinaveen Noord. Even buiten Barger Oosterveld zien we de spitstoren van het Veenkerkje. De Veenkerk van Klazinaveen Noord is een markant kerkje gesticht door dominee de Weert in de vorige eeuw. Deze dominee had niet alleen de drang om het evangelie te verkondigen, maar was ook begaan met het lot van de veenarbeiders. De mannen en de vrouwen en zelfs de kinderen die met gekromde ruggen het veen gingen delven. Tot op de dag van vandaag zie je in het Veenkerkje een kleine maar betrokken gemeente, waar je nog steeds goed kunt merken dat deze mensen door de kerk goed pastoraal begeleid zijn. Ik vind het een voorrecht om af en toe voor te gaan in deze gemeente. Ik heb veel geleerd van de historie van het veenvolkje in Zuidoost-Drenthe. De naburige gemeente is Barger-Compascuum. Daar vind je het Veenpark, een groot openluchtmuseum met een geschiedenis van ruim 100 jaar van veenarbeiders. In de winkeltjes kun je nu ook bij de bakker bijvoorbeeld eigen gebakken brood kopen. Genieten van de knippertjes en rollegies die veel weergeven van de hang en het zorgvuldig omgaan met de Drentse plattelandse traditie. In het Veenpark kan je ook een boottocht maken daar waar het water vochtig is. Zo krijg je een beeld van hoe het turf eerder vervoerd is per boot. We gaan verder naar Erika. Daar bevindt zich het Smalspoormuseum en de turfstrooiselfabriek. Op een zaterdagmiddag in de vroege herfst stonden wij, een aantal artiesten en ook ik als verhalenverteller, langs de spoorlijn. Gedurende de gehele dag kwam het treintje voorbij en stopte bij diverse deelnemers. Zo vertelde ik naast de grote braamstruik het verhaal van de veenkabouters, Pim en Pam. Deze twee mannetjes vertrekken 's ochtends vroeg met hun harkje en schepje naar hun veentuintje. Maar wat gebeurde er toen? Alle bessen, bramen en aardbeien zijn verdwenen. Hoe kan dat nou? Roept Pim. Ik weet het wel, zegt Pam. Nergens staan voetstappen. Dat betekent dat de witte wieven zijn geweest. Bestaan die dan echt? Tot op het heden is het een groot raadsel van de Zuidoosthoek van Drenthe. We zijn bijna in Duitsland. In het grensdorpje Wijteveen bevindt zich een buitengewoon bijzondere turflaag. Met trots vertellen de dorpsbewoners dat deze turfsoort nog op 2 andere plekken in de wereld te vinden is. Namelijk in de delta van de Brahmaputra en in Zuid-Engeland. De bewoners zijn hier zo trots op dat ze in het zomerseizoen een veenloop organiseren waarbij de mensen kunnen genieten van het prachtige landschap. Zuidoost-Drenthe, een plek om trots op te zijn. En zeker een bezoek waard om de vakantie door te brengen.
Las turberas españolas, un hábitat único. Las turberas son el mayor reservorio de carbonio terrestre del mundo y cuando su estado de conservación es natural o ha sido restaurada, pueden actuar como sumideros de carbonio, ayudándonos a combatir el cambio climático. Sin embargo, la mayoría de las turberas en Europa están degradadas y sus perspectivas de futuro no son positivas en la mayoría de los casos. Por la otra parte, estas turberas también están actuando como fuentes de carbonio, favoreciendo el cambio climático. En España las turberas son escasas y solo cubren el 0.07% de nuestro territorio, añadiendo un valor especial a este hábitat raro en nuestra geografía. El desconocimiento de este hábitat ha llevado a la desaparición de muchos enclaves, como por ejemplo la turbera de Estornos en Cantabria, o Saldropo en el País Vasco, debido a diversas actividades antropogénicas como la explotación de turba, la creación de pastos para ganados o más recientemente el desarrollo de parques eólicos en diferentes áreas de turberas que afectan tanto su distribución como conservación. Debido a su escasa presencia en nuestro país, su capacidad para almacenar grandes cantidades de carbonio y retenerlos es mucho menor que otros países como el Reino Unido o Irlanda. Sin embargo, sus valores ambientales como la diversidad de su flora o el archivo histórico de milenios que esconde en sus capas de turba son otros valores que deben ser tomados en cuenta a la hora de su protección y conservación. Además, algunos tipos de turberas, como la turbera cobertor, posee su límite sur en nuestro país, siendo pues un enclave esencial para entender la naturaleza del propio hábitat. Sin duda, estos hábitats necesitan una protección especial tal y como reconoce la Directiva de Hábitats Europea 9243 SC y promover un desarrollo sostenible que no afecte a este hábitat y a su papel vital en el ciclo del carbono. Todas las políticas agrarias y ganaderas de la Unión Europea deben, por tanto, tener en cuenta la conservación de este hábitat y no solo por su diversidad y valor ambiental, sino que también por su potencial para servir como un método natural para combatir el cambio climático en el estado de alarma climático actual. Guadunet Chico.
Why do you think peatlands are important beyond the ecological and climate roles that people often bring up in discussion?
Well, peatlands are not holy, of course. I am a peatland specialist, but I do not think they are far above everything else in the world. But for me, they are interesting because they are very well organised and interconnected. Peatlands are the ecosystems that are the most related to organisms. Not all peatlands have that, but important types of peatlands build up self-organisation and become similar to huge organisms. They react and develop mechanisms with which they can regulate their water level, so they built up independence. You can see peatlands growing like a child that is first protected by the parents, and the peatlands need their surroundings in order to protect itself, but after a few thousand years they self-regulate, and then they become adults. They become independent of the surroundings. In this way, peatlands are a lot stronger than other ecosystems. Another fascinating thing about peatlands is that they conserve their history in a very special way. Of course, all ecosystems have the past in themselves. You are shaped by your parents and the experiences you've had throughout your life. Peatlands operate similarly in that through peat formation, they lay down the testimony of all the things that have happened in the peat layers that subsequently accumulate. They're like a history book. That type of ordering of temporal information is very specific to peatlands, and that makes them attractive for reconstructing the past. It is much more difficult to get this information from a forest. Of course, you have old trees and dead trees, and tree stumps that say a little bit about the past, and in this way you can go back maybe 500 years. But in a peatland, you have information not only about the formation of the peatland, but also of the surrounding area that are stored in the layers of peat. There are other aspects of peat that are fascinating. For example, in Central Europe or Western Europe, you must imagine that humans started to influence the landscape on a large scale for the purpose of agriculture. In the past, everything was forest. There were only a few open spots where you could see into the distance, mostly on the peatlands. You can hardly imagine how important this is for perspective. Before agriculture came to Europe and people were living in the forest, you could only look 10 metres in front of you unless you were walking through a peatland. A peatland was the only place where you could see further in front of you, and that had an enormous impact on people, in that not only can you see further in a peatland, you also have an open connection with nature and the sky. You feel the earth trembling below you. You walk on a substance that is wetter than milk or beer, and yet you can still walk on it. One of the most fascinating things must have been that whatever shape the peatland has, you always see the horizon as a circle, and a circle is the most complete figure that exists. This must have had an enormous impact on people. So, peatlands have a lot of specialities. They're the linkage between life and death. The bog bodies that are found there, they have often been people that were sacrificed or killed, and the peat made their transition between life and death much longer. Other ecosystems don't have these kinds of qualities, so that of course, this has a metaphysical influence on people.
And what do you think is the biggest hurdle facing peatlands and their conservation today?
Well, of course, peatlands have a negative connotation. There are a lot of expressions for peatlands in the English language. Swamp, bog, mire, these all have a negative connotation. People, however, are much more positive towards forests. In Germany, forests are almost holy, and you don't have that with peat. That is an issue. The second thing is that peatlands are not very abundant. If you look worldwide, only 3% of the global land area consists of peatlands, whereas forests cover 30%. People have the idea that small things cannot be important, so forests inspire a lot more positive feelings. And because of how limited the extent of peatlands is, people can hardly imagine how much carbon a peatland holds. A peatland has 10 times more carbon per hectare than the next closest ecosystem in terms of carbon output, and that is very difficult for people to imagine. This has the effect that in the climate conventions and in the IPCC, you notice that peatland experts, or really people that know anything about peatlands, are rare. When we had the first meeting with the IPCC to prepare the wetland supplement to the IPCC guidelines, there were 100 people, of which 95 were foresters, 5 said they knew something about peatlands, and only 2 or 3 who really knew anything about peatlands. That is the proportion, so peatlands are not well known, and that makes it difficult to bring them into discussions. The discussions go very easily into the direction of forests, simply because almost all the people that discuss nature-based solutions and ecology at a governmental level are foresters. That is another hurdle. It has improved very much, however. When I started, nobody had ever heard about peatlands. But still, the consequences of draining peatlands for agriculture are beyond imagination. For example, 1 kilogram of Gouda cheese produced in the Groene Hart of the Netherlands contains 55 kilograms of CO2 because the cows that produce the milk are grazing on drained peatlands. 1 litre of milk from the same region has the same CO2 content as 2.4 litres of petrol. This impact is so beyond imagination, people cannot imagine that these cows are so negative. But when you cut down a forest, you see immediately that it is terrible. It is so obviously a negative action. But when you drain a peatland to be able to have a farm there, people see it as beneficial or as progress. That has made it difficult to give peatlands the attention that they actually deserve.
Earth lies within my name, beloved by bees, sacred to the Roman and Sicilian love goddess Venus Erycina. Immering Osiris at Byblos, where his sister Isis went to seek him. Stones heaped in a triple cairn, a womb in the hills of the ancient ageless giantess, her car drawn by elks. Her diet venison milk and eagle's breast. She hunted the mountain deer with a pack of 70 hounds with birds' names. Red and passionate. Cybele and the aesthetic self-castration of her priests, a type of emasculation of the drone by the queen bee in the nuptial act. Venus fatally courted Anchises on a mountain to the hum of bees. Son of the north wind, Buttes the bee master, given a hero shrine by the nymphs of Erycina. Ura, earth lies within my name, and my name lies on the heath. Hen, harrier, and adder, witches and wasteland, roots and stems of Genaria, Erica, and Calendula. Beloved by bees. By Heather Ackroyd and Harvey, 2020.
Dear CAP policymaker, to me, the way we treat peatlands in Germany today is one of the clearest cases of an unsustainable way of dealing with natural resources. Let me explain how I see it through a little anecdote. 120 years ago, at my home place in the Brel Valley near Bonn, the people were building big quarries for digging out precious limestone. They were building ovens and burning the stones in them to produce quicklime. Within a few decennia, the forests around the area were gone and the burning of lime was made impossible. A decree had to be made to prohibit the logging of forests for the coming generation. Limestone had to be imported from that point on. The drainage of peatland is just like this example of unsustainability. No, in fact, it is an even clearer one. Unlike forests, peatlands do not take 50 years to grow back, but thousands. On top of this, the ecological crisis we are facing now is not just a local phenomenon, but also a global one. Via the drainage of peatlands at one place, you cause negative effects on the entire planet. The people in my area didn't have an alternative to using wood for producing their quicklime. But there is an alternative for the inefficient cattle-based agriculture done on drained peatlands. The earlier we stop, the easier it will be. The only thing it requires is the bravery for small change. Change with the result of direct positive feedback. Instead of the diversity-poor landscapes that are now, the status quo On drained peatlands there could be natural landscapes full of plants and animals. Now we need a whole infrastructure of drainage facilities to keep the status quo. Whereas, if we left the peatland to recover its natural state, the system would maintain itself. It seems to me that the only reason why drainage is still happening is the fear of change. What are you waiting for? It is clear that we have to stop one day, and that every day we continue makes many things worse. Thank you very much for reading. With kind regards, Jaap Sint-Jens.
Hallo, mein Name ist Jan Peters aus Deutschland, but I will be my contribution to the Peat Anthology in English. The future of peatlands is wet. I grew up in a northwestern German city surrounded by peatlands, but all of them drained, mostly used as grasslands for cattle farming. Although many places in the countryside had the word moor, German for peatland, in their names, these were meadows with cows and deep ditches in my childhood memories. Nothing linked them in my imagination to the very few and small semi-natural meadows remained in protected areas of the region. There you could still find mosses, heather and nice boardwalks. I had no idea what peatlands are, that drainage actually leads to degradation, how they function and why they are so important for us. And I had the feeling that I was not the only one. Then I moved to Greifswald, which you see here in the backdrop, for my studies of landscape ecology. And they opened up my mind, my eyes on peatlands. I learned why they are special, how they are marvelously linked between water, soil and vegetation. What their role in climate regulation is and how beautiful they are. Only after this I realized what it means that we destroyed 98% of these unique and beautiful ecosystems in Germany and other Western European countries. During excursions and field trips, I got to know the fantastic natural mires still existing in the Baltic countries, in Russia and elsewhere on our planet, even in Cuba and Nicaragua. In the latter countries, they are as unknown to people as they have been to me for the longest. In Central Europe, we don't even know anymore how beautiful mires look like, and I started to wonder how we could better protect and restore them. The facts speak for themselves. Peatlands store vast amounts of carbon, are important for water and nutrient retention and buffering, and give habitat for endangered biodiversity. However, we also need to develop a vision how cultural peatland landscapes could look like in the future, when they wouldn't be drained anymore like they had been in the past hundreds, thousands of years, but would be wet again. People need to find their homes in and around wet peatlands and make a living from at least some of these areas. The paradigm shift from dry to wet cultivation needs to be seen as a societal task guided by integrative strategies and policies, but also accompanied by education and awareness raising so that people know what they protect. Therefore, the new CAP and the national strategic plans need to set out an ambitious transformative pathway for peatland management, which stops subsidizing destructive drainage and starts to incentivize sustainable practices like paludiculture. Of course, we cannot change land use from one day to another, but we need to have an idea how we achieve our obligations towards humankind and nature step by step and take the people along with us. Let's pave the way for better, wetter peatland future together. Thank you.
I've walked the peat world in Scotland, Wales and the Arctic. On a remote Scottish island, the land around the old cottage where I used to stay was etched with the old marks of peat cutting, and the old people told me how they would cut the peat, dry it and use it as a soft burning flame through the winters. Never cut too much, never take too much, they said. Live gently, for there are others coming. It was used carefully because in the long view it wasn't really their possession. It was their responsibility. It isn't really ours now. For something so steeped in history, so significant for all, something so old that it takes thousands of years to form a meter, cannot belong to one generation. The peatlands, muskegs, boglands, and fens breathed in eons ago. Its breath held, it stored carbon. And then, within the brief moment of modernity, it is breathing out, a breath of smoke and carbon released. So slow for peat to form, so quick for it to be destroyed. Peat is a symbol for the earth and its experience of global heating. Once alight, peat can smolder, gradually burning deeper and wider and often undetected for months and years. So slow we were to notice climate change, so immediate now the responsibility. In the permafrost peatlands of the far north, ice is turning to fire, 1,000 years going up in one momentary flame. Turning the eternal into the temporary, turning the proliferation of life into death and finiteness. J. Griffiths.
Knocking down cathedrals. I will never forget the spectacle that confronted me when I first visited the Hammerhead levels in Yorkshire in the late 1980s. Behind the shabby huts and tram lines of the peatworks, as far as you could see, there extended an immense desert of totally stripped out black, gleaming peat, and area equivalent to that of a small city. The shifting light illuminated the great sweep of the milling fields, devoid of even a single bobtail of cotton grass, as the diggers and cranes looming out on the moor like space-age dinosaurs picked over the wetland until there was nothing left. As we looked on horrified and helpless, it seemed that this extraordinary natural system, which had taken 3,000 years to evolve, would in 10 years be gone, taken away bag by bag, crumb by crumb, to be scattered on people's gardens. Now, nature has returned to the Hammerhead levels. There are curlews, snipe, and even breeding cranes, while harriers and short-eared owls patrol the expanses of dancing cotton grass. In 2004, the peat producers departed. Since then, between 2014 and the summer of 2018, the European Union's Life Plus project has extended the peat bog area under active restoration and ensured that across 2,887 hectares the peat is now wet enough for sand use and wild cranberry, and all the specialized bird life of Niger and Hobby which accompany them. Best of all, only 16 years since the Hammerhead levels were a scourge industrial wasteland, the mosses are growing again, spilling out over the edges of the trackways, and, like the corals of a reef, rebuilding the raised mires, as they have done for over 3 millennia. It is a reversal of fortune and rebirth, which I had never thought I would live to see. But this EU success in Yorkshire is undermined by a far greater failure in relation to peatland management throughout Europe. If you go to the Hammerhead levels today, you will find that the old peatworks are still there in the middle of the restored nature reserve and appear to be as busy as ever. There are plenty of peat bills, although they are no longer scorched from the now protected wetlands. This peat that is being packaged up and sent around the UK has been shipped in across the North Sea via the nearby port of Goul from the magnificent and unprotected raised mires of Estonia in the Baltic. Similar wreckage is taking place to the lowland mires of Finland, which is also in the EU. Meanwhile, all over Europe, the CAP is contributing to the continued ploughing of peat for intensive agriculture, which increases carbon in the atmosphere and eliminates the potential of restoring such land to wetland habitats. In Norfolk, the St. Germans pumping station control the hub of the main waterways which flow into the North Sea. This pumping station facilitates intensive grant-aided farming on the immediately surrounding fenland, so that the peat, which dries and wastes away as it is cultivated, emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere equivalent to 0.3% of the UK's annual industrial emissions, or that of a small city. The destruction of Europe's peatlands hastens climate change and is the ecological equivalent of knocking down a cathedral and using the dust to line the garden path. Jeremy Pursglove, 2020.
Peat sheep. My father's farm is closed for decades now, but there are 4 old sheep ladies grazing the meadows around the old house, carrying many stories untold. Our sheep belong to the breed of the white Polish heath, or, in original language, Moorsnoeken. Moorsnoeken are a breed originated in the moorland of Lower Saxony, but almost died out entirely with the ongoing drainage of peatlands in Germany. With wool too coarse and their muscle flesh too thin, they did not seem profitable for the agricultural business. Rearing meat sheep breeds instead. It makes sense that in a society without respect for the peatlands, peat sheep are left behind as well. After being listed as an endangered domestic breed and through the efforts of nature conservationists and breeders, the number of Moorsnoeken sheep in Germany has risen to 5,000 of its kind. But many of them live, just like our sheep ladies, separated from their natural habitat, the moor. But once you pay attention to these sheep, you will discover a bunch of qualities that resulted from their centuries-lasting, intimate relationship with their natural habitat,
the peatlands. Some hidden peat abilities of these moor sheep include: walk knee-deep water, get themselves out of bog holes, light and delicate, can walk the peatlands without sinking, eats wild plants such as purple moor, grass, mosses, sedge, can survive on a nutrient-poor diet. And their contribution to wetlands include grazing groves and plants, protect the poor from forestation, and rejuvenating the heather.
John Lind. Perhaps the most amazing thing about Homo sapiens is her adaptability. Earth has seen steppe people, forest people, mountain people, tundra people, bog people, sea people, and desert people. The Neolithic Revolution, roughly 10,000 years ago, was the starting point that eventually would render sedentary agricultural society dominant. It was mainly the cultures that adopted agriculture that went on to form cities and states as we recognize them today. The relative inaccessibility of other landscapes brought them an aura of mystery and danger, and could act as a refuge for the persecuted. Our folk tales tell us of the forest-dwelling Robin Hood and seafaring pirates. Bogs were once a place for eerie sacrifices, and the ancient Chinese epic outlaws of the marshlands speaks for itself. Why is it relevant now? This process is not just confined to the nerdy business of archaeology and history students like me, but a process that is still continuing today. As different landscapes carry different preconditions for living, they also became harborers for different cultures. They sometimes got along peacefully, sometimes not. The raids of the Huns and Mongols from the steppes on agricultural communities are perhaps among the most famous examples. The ever-ongoing deforestation of the Amazon for agricultural land is a more recent example. Europe does not have a tropical rainforest like the Amazon, but we do have wetlands which hold an astounding biodiversity of species also valuable to humans. They hold peat, which keep the atmosphere safe from immense amount of CO2 and slows erosion by trapping sediments, purifies water by trapping pollutants, retains water that can mitigate floods as well as droughts, and stops wildfires in its tracks, all affliction predicted to increase in the nearby future. All afflictions predicted to increase in the nearby future. Even history itself rests in the bogs. Without the natural and cultural archives granted by its anaerobic conditions, the knowledge of ourselves and Earth would be significantly poorer. I do not believe that either tales or history have a deterministic influence on our minds and actions, but the cultural history of landscapes help explain why wetlands and their inhabitants acquired such an undeservedly bad reputation. But the cultural history of landscapes help explain why wetlands and their inhabitants acquired such an undeservedly bad reputation. Perhaps the biases it generated help explain why Northern Europe, where I grew up, often finds no better use for peatlands than to burn them. The strife they underpin may help explain why land unsuitable for agriculture due to high groundwater gets diagnosed at Wattensjuk, English for water sick, and drained, while paludiculture is ignored. But as students of history should know, and the European Union itself is a remarkably successful example of, strife should be followed by reconciliation and restoration. It has become time to think about landscapes the same way, not only in the cases where it might be useful for respecting the diversity of cultures, but also from a purely scientific view, as it is becoming abundantly clear that all of Earth's ecosystems are interconnected and codependent. The economic importance of any one landscape type is thus not an argument against, but in favor of the preservation of other landscapes, given that the Earth system science is properly recognized. Besides, restoring our wetlands does not need to be the creation of some no-touch museum enclosure. We can live from and with these lands as well. Does it sound weird? That's just because we have a few millennia of peer pressure to kick. Wetlands play a fundamental role in maintaining hospitable planetary conditions, and the truth is that we have been living thanks to them all along, even when we have not noticed it. Let's notice it now.
Waterworks is an ambitious undertaking that could change the mindset of a generation, as well as achieving positive action against climate change by reducing CO2 emissions from peat soils. The Waterworks project is located within the Great Fen in Cambridgeshire, England. This is a visionary landscape where carefully controlled raising of water levels and the gradual re-wetting of peat soils is creating a 3,700 hectare mosaic of wet habitats. A watery haven for rare fenland species and a new green lung for the ever-burgeoning populations of Cambridgeshire. The Great Fen is, however, the exception, not the rule. The wetlands of East Anglia have been drained for agriculture over the centuries, exposing peat soils which dry out and blow away, and in doing so emit CO2. A third of all agricultural CO2 emissions in the UK come from the fens. A more sustainable system is needed. Switching away from this dry, arable system to wet farming, also known as paludiculture, where the water table is held near the surface, could protect peat soils, lock in CO2, clean water and support wildlife, as well as providing new opportunities and income for farmers, landowners, growers and producers. Waterworks will demonstrate a combined integrated paludiculture system with 4.5 hectares of field-scale trials, showing that it is possible to grow new wet farming crops on a fen farm. The four main crops to be tested are common reed, reed mace, sphagnum moss, and sweet manna grass. This last one is a Western equivalent of wild rice and was gathered from the wild until the beginning of the 20th century, but its potential as a cultivated crop has never been explored. In addition to these main crops, we are also going to be testing up to 20 other wetland species, which can be used as foods, flavourings, or which have biomedical applications. All these wet farming crops have the potential for new, sustainable income streams for the region's farmers and growers. Spreading the word and showing what can be done in real-life conditions to working farmers and landowners is a huge part of the project. In showing what can be done, the Great Fen is hoping to create a ripple effect, changing perceptions and practices across a generation of fenland farmers and reversing the enormous carbon losses from our agriculturalised peat soils. If wet farming catches on in the fens, wildlife will benefit too, as projects such as the Great Fen will need a higher water table to sustain its wetlands and will be less isolated, giving nature a wider network in which to recover.
Dear agricultural policymaker, I'm sure you've got a lot of reports on peatlands to read at the moment, so I thought, well, I can offer some images to help bear these points in mind. I'm an artist working to support peatland restoration in Scotland, and the banner here was made for a peat bog workshop. Families joined in and helped sow newly restored peat bog with sphagnum moss. This is a line written by poet Joss Smith. Something as small as a wish can root and breathe the peat alive again. So here is a request. Please put peatlands in the picture. Silverflower is one of the best preserved peat bogs in southwest Scotland. That's in the picture here. Have you been on a healthy, squelchy, wet peatland? It rocks when you jump. Here's an impression of different bog mosses under a microscope. Sphagnum mosses or bog mosses absorb rainwater and create peat over millennia. I'm doing a project in the Netherlands just now, and I'm learning how this country has been drained from peatlands over centuries. An unimaginable amount of peat has disappeared through this. When I started in January, there was a small cactus on my desk. Sadly, it hasn't really thrived. I think it would be better off in a desert. The brown earth under the white pebbles looks like peat, which is a wetland soil. So here's a cactus trying to grow on peat moss, and an uncomfortable question surfaces. Where did its peat come from? During COVID lockdown, people turned to gardening. Piles of compost bags arrived in gardens next to me. Almost all brands seemed to contain peat. I began to collect the bags from my neighbours. They too wanted to know where the peat comes from. Nobody likes the idea that their own gardening might damage other places. But peat in garden compost does cause damage to wetlands, and it has to be wrong that peat is extracted from countries where large peat bogs still exist to be used for gardening in the Netherlands and elsewhere. When peatlands are demolished, histories and sustainable futures disappear. So I drew a cactus to symbolise growing the wrong plants on peat. Don't get me wrong, I like cacti, but they don't need peat bogs. A cactus really shouldn't be grown in peat. This is a water table. The legs are different lengths because people don't agree about what the ideal height is. Right now, things seem to be slipping off the water table, but it's urgent for the climate and other reasons to stop peatlands drying out. Wetland species are finding it hard to hang on, so we need to level up the water table. Please get round the table at the Common Agricultural Policy talks. Please stop wetland drainage altogether. And please support new methods of nurturing peatlands. Thank you.
Wherever you're drawn, there's magic to be found in the landscape around you. From a young age, I developed a strong admiration for mountainous landscapes. It made me feel grounded and connected with myself and the natural world around me. One of the places I have traveled to a few times is Beerstada National Park in Poland, initially driven by my love for the vastness of its mountains. Wandering through the park, I came across some stunning raised bog areas, such as the Tarnava Nature Reserve. I was immediately attracted to the mystery and magnificence of the small reserve. With only a total area of 5.25 hectares, it consists of 2 peat bogs divided by a stream. The larger bog is beautifully covered with peat mosses, sphagnum, that have been there slowly growing for thousands of years. Though what struck me the most was the fairy tale impression of the swamp forest. As I walked on the wooden trail in the warm glow of a setting sun, I was surrounded by the silver-colored birches and fluffy white cottongrass flower heads in the undergrowth, reflecting the last rays of sunlight. I remember this moment as one of the first times I had a close encounter with the intense beauty of a well-developed bog. Slowly, my love and fascination for these wet landscapes grew. Also, I started to realize that even in Belgium, the country I live in, there are remains of these delicate habitats. Unfortunately, these are too often in a degraded state, and we are facing many challenges to protect and restore them. In Europe, approximately 95% of its peatlands are degraded, releasing their stored carbon and losing their value for biodiversity conservation and water resource management at an alarming rate. This can only be changed by acting today. I am very grateful to take part in this change every day by working for the nature conservation organization Natuurpunt, an NGO who is, among other, restoring peatlands on a local scale, and also putting this in a broader European context in the project Interreg CarePeat, together with different European nature organizations, knowledge institutes and private landowners, because we can't let these unique and magic landscapes disappear.
Global importance of myriads. Myriads of different types are part of landscapes in the whole Earth, but depending on the temperature and precipitation, their properties, area and age varies a lot. The oldest myriads occur in tropics, but by the area they prevail in the Nordic countries. The boreal zone myriads are younger, as they began to develop after the end of the last ice age. All that used to be earlier was swept away by glaciers and ice meltwater. Despite the different ages of the myriads, these ancient landscapes have developed for a long time without the influence of human activities. From the earliest days of agriculture, fires in myriads have been more frequent than before, indicating a significant human impact on myriads. However, this is not comparable to the impact that began a few centuries ago, when more and more energy was needed to keep industries running. The powerful machines created in the course of industrial development once again enabled the agricultural revolution, during which myriads were drained and used in agriculture. Later, the myriads were also drained for forestry. For example, today, about 60% of myriads in Europe are drained. How does the drainage of myriads affect the Earth's climate? The global impact of drainage is that natural myriads that bind atmospheric carbon in the peat deposit has changed to drained peatlands, which, in the contrary, are important carbon emitters, increasing content of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, what is the most important reason of nowadays climate change. Today, discussions about the anthropogenic causes of carbon dioxide emissions is an important topic of political debate. To solve the problem, tree planting is proposed as one important tool for reducing CO2 emissions. As the trees grow, they bind in a large amount of carbon in their biomass. It seems likely a good solution. But what if a tree dies of old age, competing with others, or destroyed by fire? By growing trees, a large amount of carbon can be captured in a short time, but it is again released into the atmosphere about as fast as it was taken away. It would be partially preserved if the tree trunks are buried in peat, in a mire with natural hydrological conditions, of course. Solving climate problems in the hope of afforestation is also not justified by the fact that in today's overcrowded world, forests tend to burn. Forest fires are especially common if trees are planted on drained peatlands, where both trees and peat burn. Let us recall, for example, the major fires of 1997 and 2005 in Indonesia, in 2010 in Russia near Moscow. In Estonia, too, forest fires occur, mainly in forest stands established on drained peatlands. Forests planted on mineral land are also burning extensively. In Australia, in America, in Spain and Portugal, in Siberia. Satellite photos show that the Siberian forest fires will subside when they reach mires to natural wet bogs. Thus, the most important reason why mires should be kept is the climate regulation. What I want to emphasize with the examples above is, first, we must have great respect for the nature that has evolved here on Earth long before humanity began to transform it. Second, it is our inevitability that we must preserve that part of the natural peatlands that has not yet been degraded by human activity and return to the nature those we have benefited from, in a state from which nature itself can begin to heal itself. It means restoration or reclamation before leaving peatlands behind. We do not manage large-scale disasters caused by human activity. We must ask nature for help, and we must help nature to help us. We have no choice. With the respect, Laimi Trus, expert of the EU project Live Peat Restore.
I was recently artist in residence in Lloya Aire in southern Spain in the Parque Natural Sierra Maria Los Beles, Andalusia. I was surrounded by almond groves. From the day I arrived, I was fascinated by the soil texture and the deep tilled furrows of the terraced fields. I also found myself wondering why this landscape looked like it did. The roads were hard because of constant travel. They were compacted soil. The clay content of the soils in the area is extremely high. My drawing shows a path made by heavy farming machinery. My present soil project focuses on this, compaction caused by heavy machinery. The FAO has determined this to be the most costly and serious problem caused by conventional agriculture. The results of compaction are many. Firstly, causing puddling of the soil. The soil is actually too wet with insufficient air to allow plants to grow properly. Their growth is reduced or stunted, the crop yield is dramatically decreased, and the quality of the crop too. Reversing surface compaction is an extremely difficult process, and the most severe form of compaction leads to the formation of pans deeper in the soil. At present, there is no means to reserve this.
Dear all who hold the power to make a change. I grew up in Estonia, surrounded by thousands of hectares of peatlands, but never learned their value until leaving, and it was first in Austria where I learned about the importance of peatlands and how badly they have been treated in the past, and still are. This is the gap in the society that deserves to be filled if we really want to make a change. Peatlands in all their shapes and sizes have to be included into the discussion of nature protection and conservation, rising carbon emissions, changing agricultural practices, land conversion, and fighting climate change in general. Right now, peatlands are undervalued, harmed, and not in focus. A well-known peatland researcher, Professor Lindsay, illustrates it in a perfect way as a habitat which is almost invisible within the national consciousness. He furthermore compares peatlands to the Cinderella, that they do all the work, but get almost no credit, and majority are not even aware of their existence and the wider services they provide. It is evident that in order to preserve natural capital, ecosystem must be strongly tied with economic principles, and ultimately conservation comes down to politics. Conflicts regarding natural resources and following environmental degradation are the consequences of political and institutional shortcomings and incompetence in dealing with those issues within policies and legislation. Conservation can therefore not be objective, but has to include social and even emotional issues to have a holistic approach. Environmental problems do not only reflect failures of policies and markets, but are an expression of political and economic forces displaying development of capitalism in the last centuries, and the following extensive natural resources extraction for economic growth. Social policies and institutional linkages governing the natural resource management are complex and well acknowledged. Thus, natural resource management is not independent from physical and socio-political contexts, and studying these issues has to include determining different stakeholders and institutions, moreover strategies and norms, relations and politics within society in wider contexts to understand that decision-making processes and natural resource management entails many different levels, and it is pluralistic in nature. In 2017, there was 26,100 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent net emissions in Estonia, mainly from the energy section. Wetlands were estimated to emit 750.1 kilotons, approximately 3%, of which majority originate from extraction of peat and to some extent also from unmanaged wetlands. This is 2.3 to 2.7 times higher than it would be when the local bogs and mires would still be intact. Between 1950 and 1980, the primary cause for loss of wetlands in Estonia was drainage for agricultural purposes. Although these practices have been discontinued, the degradation of wetlands is still ongoing due to those past activities. Forceful institutional support is surely crucial to ensure sustainable development both on environmental and social level. It is thus that peatlands and the utilization of peat has to be considered more thoroughly for the new agricultural policy that unfortunately still supports the drainage of one of the most valuable ecosystems on Earth that consume more carbon than any other terrestrial ecosystem. Where do we go from here? How can we change the mentality of society if the governance lacks attention towards the issue? It is surely challenging to evaluate the variety of values wetlands provide and include the economic interest and both direct and indirect factors within. Nevertheless, it is time to take action, to change the perspective of the citizens, to appreciate these national treasures, and the policymakers to start paying attention to a more comprehensive approach regarding natural resource management. Thank you for listening. Aitäh, et lõpuni lugesid. Mari-Liis Kotsar.
The swamps. It greeted me with a sure and snobbish smile, drowning its presence. Yet it's very there, or it's here, feet over its connected enormity. This ancient myriad had been laughing silently on our ways, but shy ways. From our roads for centuries it vomits, on our lowest points in history. If it could just slap us with its old vines, it keeps burying its unstable face under the God-know-what lives in holes, hides with those cold-blooded. Honor the sacred shyness, its secrets. Defog not, unflood never. Befriend the unsure.
Letter from Mayor to Grecian. Dear policymakers, I have lived in cities almost my whole life. I grew up in Rotterdam and later I moved to Amsterdam for my studies. During my bachelor's in future planet studies, I started to be more and more interested in the topic of land use and forest. This made me decide to move to Stockholm to do my master's, Globalization, Environment and Social Change, because I was attracted to the idea of living in forest in Sweden. Throughout my studies, my interest gradually changed from forests and land use to agriculture. I came to realize that through agriculture, we as humans have the biggest impact on the planet, and that now this impact is quite negative. However, what I also realized during these years of studying is that I had learned all about global issues related to land use and climate change, but at the same time, I didn't know anything about the natural environment in the Netherlands. The environment where I grew up, around the corner from home, so I moved back to the Netherlands with an urge of wanting to know my personal environment better. What is the piece of land around the corner? What is the type of tree in my backyard? I had no idea. I had travelled to many places around the world, but I didn't even know the wetlands of Amsterdam. Then I found out about Weiland, a Dutch company that is restoring ecosystems, and I thought, whoa, it's actually possible to create a life from a desert and make it green again. I decided that I wanted to get my hands into the field of ecosystem ecosystems restoration. However, I knew that if I wanted to work in this area, I could not only learn about it in books, I had to experience it. So I started to work on a farm, to learn from the farmers and to be in the landscape. That's how I ended up at the farm Groene Griffioen, near Weesp. And that's how I met Martin, who had started MoMA. When I told him about this urge of mine to learn about my local environment, he said, well, let's do it, and let's take other people along with us on this journey. That is how the campaign Het Groene Verbond began. It was the idea that consumers should have an opportunity to have a voice in the debate about how the agricultural system and the landscapes looks. We should be able to have conversations with farmers and local producers on how to shape the future landscape and make decisions collectively. We put a third of the profits from MoMA aside and let the collective decide which restorations process to implement in the area. Our ultimate goal is to restore the landscape, which also means to restore the peatlands, but restoring the land not just in the physical sense, but is also about restoring our personal connection to it as consumers, citizens and creatures. This personal connection starts by knowing our natural environment. I didn't know what peat was until 2 years ago, when I started working on this farm, and I know that most people in Amsterdam or the Netherlands also don't know much about the land they were born on. That's what we tried to get across by bringing small blocks of peat to people in the city and making them hold it into their hands. With this, we want to share the message that, hey, this peat is our soil, this is what we live on, we should take care of it. The money that we set aside from the Grondverbond is quite limited, and it could have so much more impact if we would get subsidies from the government or from the European Union. That's why I'm writing to you, policymakers, because I would like to ask you to pay more attention to the topic of peatlands and landscape restoration and to create more subsidies to support restoration practices and initiatives. I believe that governments have the responsibility to listen to science, to that same science telling us that our land is sinking because of peatlands drainage, that sea levels are rising, and that emissions coming from drained peatlands are heavily impacting our climate. This science is also telling us about the power of certain lands, like peatlands, to be natural protective barriers against climate change. Therefore, protecting and restoring the land also means protecting and restoring our future on this planet. It doesn't matter whether you are from the city or from the countryside, whether you grew up in a house next to a beautiful peatland or on the 7th floor of a high concrete building in Den Haag. We are all directly or indirectly connected to our landscape. Our landscape is our past, our present, and our future. We live on the land and we depend on it. Knowing and restoring our landscape is like knowing and restoring ourselves. So once again, make more subsidies for land restoration practices and make long-term decisions about the landscape based on science. After all, it's a responsibility of governments to protect their citizens and their future. Our peatlands are sinking, and so are we. There's no time to waste. What are you waiting for? Kind wishes, Mayor Teresha. How do I stop it?
As a young boy, I remember the Irish bogs so well. My father converted an old canal barge into a semi-livable houseboat, and my family spent a number of summers travelling up and down the Grand Canal through the Irish Midlands as we watched countless shoals of perch, bream and rudd swim ahead of us, and watched as bright blue kingfishers tried to get away from the boat by flying in front of it until they realised that they had to let us past. The pristine water of the Grand Canal, originating in Pollardstown, Fen, near Robertstown, had once been used to make Guinness in Dublin. These journeys through the Midlands allowed me to see the work of Bord na Mona, the Irish peat board, at first hand in a way that few others did in those days, as there were very few roads through our Midland bogs. We marvelled at the lifting rail bridges over the old canal. I remember the great excitement of finding a bee orchid beside one of them as we waited for a lifting bridge to open. The extensive light rail system operated by Bord na Mona allowed industrially excavated peat to be transported to power stations at far-flung places like Lanesborough and Shannon Bridge along the River Shannon. I remember seeing an old peat briquette factory by the side of the canal, at Ticknavin, I think. What Bord na Mona did as part of a fledgling Irish state in the middle of the 20th century was quite remarkable. They provided innovative industry in areas which might otherwise have been left behind in dire poverty. They developed machinery to excavate peat on a scale not previously imagined. Initially, the peat burning power stations were a significant part of the Irish electricity grid. However, the environmental cost was not understood or considered. Thousands of years of hard work by our natural peatlands as carbon was taken from the atmosphere and stored in our bogs went up in smoke in decades for some horribly inefficient electricity generation which has ended up being heavily subsidised. Millions of tons of carbon sent up into the sky partly to power our washing machines, our ovens, our kettles and our toasters. Innovative, perhaps, but only if we completely ignore the environmental costs and the mind-blowing unsustainability of such a venture. While the power stations are being closed and other peatland exploitation activities are slowly coming to an end, degraded and drained peatlands in Ireland are still emitting millions of tons of carbon each year, and this includes marginal land which has also been drained for farming. In fact, about 20 tonnes of carbon is emitted into the atmosphere every minute from degraded peatlands in Ireland, equivalent to the weight of 4 African bull elephants from what should be the most efficient ecological carbon store on the planet. What we now know, we didn't know then. Now we have to turn things around and live our lives in a more sustainable way. There is no reason why we can't again be inventive and innovative based on today's knowledge by re-wetting and restoring our peatlands in a way that provides an income to local people. In terms of farmland, wetland farming, paludiculture is one option. Carbon farming is another. We can end emissions and move back to carbon sequestration as we develop new methods of payment for capturing carbon and providing other ecosystem services as well. 1/5 of Ireland is peatland. It should be seen for what it is, a hugely valuable, oft beautiful resource. It can help us to reach net zero carbon if we simply learn to value it for what it is.
This poem, Bog Oakman, is about some of the treasures that can be found underneath the bogs in Ireland. The surface of the bog is bright with red sundews and asphodels. Pillows of moss in red and green form hummocks among deep pools. Such small and delicate plants, but deep down there are giants. Mighty oaks and pines and yew on a drier surface grew millennia ago. Wetter times cause moss to grow and swamp the trees beneath the bog, where acid waters pickle the logs. Stumps and trunks of ancient trees, ripped from deep peat by turf machines, all piled high in the craftsman's yard. In air soft wood turns iron hard. Working alone in his workshop, he gently handles fragile wood. Wire brushing away loose out of flakes, his practiced craftsman's eye finds shapes. Grain of wood reveals its form. With dusk mask on, he sands the oak. A polish reveals its inky glow. Bog pine a golden yellow shows. Flying birds and abstract lines transform the beauty of rare wood. Skilled hands carve faces from past myth in stumps retrieved from 'neath the peat. Their black remains and severed roots, rare remnants of a vanished world.
Peatlands in Chile. 4% of global peatlands are located in South America, mainly located in the Chilean and Argentinian Patagonia. These peatlands belong to the Magellanic tundra type and are dominated by different species of sphagnum mosses. Particularly, Chilean Patagonian peatlands cover 3.1 million hectares and approximately 4,800 million tons of carbon accumulated over 18,000 years. This is 4.7 times more carbon than the above-ground biomass of forests in Chile. Over here, peat is considered a mineral and its exploitation is under the mining law. As said before, Chilean peatlands are dominated by mosses, and there are approximately 16 endemic sphagnum species, where Sphagnum magellanicum is one of the most abundant and also the most exploited. Actually, Chile is one of the main exporters of this moss, with more than half of the global market selling it mainly to Taiwan, China, and South Korea. And still, there is no regulation being applied to its extraction. But even worse, the locals do not know peatlands at all, and do not value wetlands or sphagnum mosses at all. They are just quote-unquote worthless swamps, except for the sphagnum moss, which is extracted in an unsustainable manner in order to get some pennies, but with a huge cost for the environment and the drinking water in many places. After this short story of peatlands in Chile, I must say that fortunately, most of Patagonian peatlands are still pristine and intact, not because they are valued or protected, but because they are still inaccessible. It's true, some changes and laws are being made, but not at the pace they have to be done, because the destruction of these ecosystems can be more catastrophic and expensive than we can imagine. But that is something that can be seen in Northern Europe and Canada, where such big areas of peatlands have already been destroyed. Finally, I would like to say that there's still a lot of pristine peatlands in the world, but they are threatened all the time because there are still buyers in the developed world which are demanding this precious natural resource, and therefore it is seen as gold for some eyes that won't hesitate to go out there and dig until the very last gold nugget. Europe is looked upon by many countries around the world as an example. It would be nice if, through their decision in the upcoming CAP, the European Union would show the rest of the world that they value peatlands.
Could you give a short introduction to yourself and the organisation Stop Ecocide?
My name is Charlene, and I'm the head of advocacy and strategic partnerships for Stop Ecocide Foundation, which runs the Stop Ecocide Change the Law campaign. The late Polly Higgins was the one who started this campaign to make ecocide a fifth atrocity crime at the International Criminal Court. I started collaborating with Polly on the campaign in 2012, helping her with advancing the discourse on ecocide and giving her access to the annual Assembly of States parties of the ICC, where we would have yearly side events on ecocide. Since Polly passed away in April 2019, I formalized my position with the foundation and my work revolves around advocacy and strategic planning for our legal and diplomatic work.
What was your experience working with legal and governmental systems with Stop Ecocide been like? What has your experience working with legal and governmental systems with Stop? Okay. What has your experience working with legal and governmental systems with Stop Ecocide been like? Why do you feel that this is a valuable path towards radical change in the protection and preservation of the environment?
It's been rewarding and at times challenging. However, I'm confident that slow and easy does it, albeit with a great perception for practical haste since we all know the urgency of the matter. Resorting to international criminal law is a great way to protect our common home and common heritage once and for all. It will fill the gaps found in various multilateral environmental agreements and advance the recognition of protecting the environment as a permanent norm, a norm for which no derogation is allowed. It is a signal that the international community will no longer tolerate assaults on/harm to the environment.
A lot of Stop Ecocide's work has been with the International Criminal Court. Do you see potential in legal protections at the EU parliamentary level to prevent ecological destruction? Do you think this could be an effective method for specific landscapes such as peatlands?
Our mission is to make ecocide a crime at the international level. I certainly see value in the EU Parliament's participation in such a campaign at the EU level. This has been done before in 2012, where a European Citizens Initiative was launched to urge the European Commission to adopt legislation to prohibit, prevent and preempt ecocide. However, the campaign we ran did not manage to collect the 1 million signatures required for the EC to consider such a proposal. The timing in 2012 may not have been ideal, but fast forward to 2020, I believe the appetite might be there. At the EU level, there is a legislative basis to ensure adequate protection for our ecosystems, including peatlands. See, for instance, the 1992 Habitats Directive, where the EU, aiming to promote the maintenance of biodiversity, calls for the preservation, protection and improvement and recognition of continued deteriorate. Where did I start?
See, for instance. See, for instance.
Is it already?
Yeah.
Okay. See, for instance, the 1992 Habitats Directive, where the EU, aiming to promote the maintenance of biodiversity, calls for preservation, protection and improvement and recognition of continued deterioration of natural habitats and of wild flora and fauna. The Habitats Directive is also supplemented by the 2008 Environmental Crime Directive, where effective, proportionate and dissuasive criminal penalties are called for at member states' discretion.
Do you feel like legal protections of ecosystems could also translate into changing the way society values nature at a personal level?
In an ideal world, we do not need laws to dictate how we should value nature, but they can definitely play a part in establishing a minimum standard. In a democratic society like the EU, the people are entitled to use their voices to get heard on important matters like the protection of ecosystems. In reality, societal values can differ, but the protection of our environment is a no-brainer. Safeguarding the environment is crucial in an economy that is dependent on it.
What message would you like to pass on along personally to the MEPs who will eventually read your contribution?
I wish every MEP would leave behind an environmental legacy. It is long-termism.
What message would you like to pass along personally to the MEPs who will eventually read your contribution?
I wish every MEP would leave behind an environmental legacy. It is long-termism at its best. It is truly doing the people they represent a favor in leaving the environment either intact or better than they found it, not worse. Using the economic development excuse should no longer be valid in the 21st century if sustainability is to be achieved. Globalization made way for economic development, but it went out of hand. The Global South is no better today, and the impact of our environment has only been negative. Economic activities that value the environment and society should be called economic enhancement instead. Give a man a potato and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to grow potatoes and you feed him for a lifetime. Also, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. In short, all MEPs should champion for a legislative change locally and regionally to introduce a crime of ecocide.
Dear Pete, can I just say that it was so great to meet you back in Tassie in 2013? Who would have known that me accidentally trampling on the mossy head of a 1 centimetre tall 10-year-old sphagnum plant was the moment that began our lifelong relationship. I've often wondered how you felt that day. I wonder how often you get trampled upon and the trampler doesn't even notice. I would like to tell you more often how much I truly appreciate you being in the world. I really appreciate that you find a place and a way to store 644 gigatons of carbon. This is a lot of carbon, Pete. 1 gigaton is 1 billion metric tons, and a metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. That's 644 billion tons, and you stash it away without anyone even noticing. I know that I don't say it enough, so I'm saying it now. It really means a lot to me that you've kept this carbon out of the atmosphere. If we were to release all of this into the atmosphere, my back of the envelope calculation says that this would result in at least 10 degrees of warming, which is a lot more than the climate models currently project in the worst case scenario, which is 6.4 degrees of warming under the future scenario IPCC RCP 8.5. I can't even imagine what my life would look like, and actually I really don't want to. I remember when we met on Kagari back in 2018. I arrived by boat with Bernie and Martin. And you were there too. You were there because the pooled rainwater formed indents on the island's surface where the dead plant matter in these anoxic pools did not properly decompose. This dead plant matter amalgamated and compacted at the bottom of what became lakes. Now people come from all over the world to see these brilliant, uniquely coloured lakes. You did such a beautiful job colouring these lakes. This is actually the most beautiful landscape that I have ever seen, and it's all because of you, Pete. You really are an underground star. I've seen you on so many Fraser Island postcards, but no one even knows your name. Do you ever get sick of people posing and taking selfies with you without your permission? Well, I really want to take the time to say thank you. Thank you for a magical holiday, a beautiful landscape, storing billions of tons of carbon and helping to maintain a safe temperature on this planet. But speaking of people doing things without your permission, I wonder if it's not too painful to ask about the forced removal of so many peatlands during the last 1,000 years. How are you feeling about that now? I know that in many areas of northwestern Europe, peatlands were extracted for use as fuel. In the Netherlands, they removed 19.8 cubic kilometres of peat. This fuel availability enabled an expanding population. Do you know that in the Netherlands, people designed a special shoe so that they could walk around easily with you? It's called a klomp or a clog. Personally, I love their chunkiness, but I wonder if the wood cuts into the bones of the foot. I've never tried them. I wonder why they aren't called a peat shoe. In my head, I call them beinschoenen. How did you feel when they began to dig ditches to drain you of water? Did it feel good to dry out a bit? Or were you happy the way that you were, wading through the fresh water? What about when the ditches were full and people began to build windmills to transfer the water to the sea? Did you appreciate having new structures in your life? How did you feel about the cows arriving? You are so soft, Pete. You are so soft that it's actually quite difficult to drive over your surface with heavy machinery. Are the cows kind to you? Do you enjoy hanging out with them? Is it fun? I'm lactose intolerant, so I don't eat cheese, but it's so popular here in the Netherlands. It's become an unofficial national icon, and it's all because of you, Pete. You are so modest, so mysterious, so underground, that many people, even here in the Netherlands, don't know that you exist. Though I do see that they go out to visit you sometimes, often by bike, and often when the sun is out. Do you enjoy hosting these visitors? Sometimes people laugh at me when I say that you are the focus of my PhD project. Maybe they think you are boring and weird because you only exist underground and in such a compacted format. I don't care what they say. I know that you provide a home for billions and trillions of microscopic organisms. Wow, what a service you do. What a household to maintain. I grew up with 6 sisters. I know that in a couple of square centimeters of your household, there are more microbes than there are people in my family. There are more microbes than there are people at my university. There are more microbes than there are people in this country. Actually, I know that in a couple of square centimeters of your household, there are more microbes than there are humans on this planet. Wow, Pete, you really do so much. Microbial organisms are incredibly important for regulating the dominant greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. Without microbial organisms, the greenhouse concentration of the atmosphere would be very different, and our soils would be depleted of nutrients and incapable of growing foods for humans. Thank you, Pete. Thank you for a magical holiday, a beautiful landscape, storing billions of tons of carbon, helping to maintain a safe temperature on this planet, bringing wealth and prosperity to the Netherlands, providing a home to trillions of microscopic organisms, and continuing to assist maintaining a safe greenhouse gas balance in the Earth's atmosphere. Pete, thank you. Maybe people don't approve of the relationship because of the age gap. I don't care what they say. I look for you everywhere I go. I look for you at the window of the Amsterdam metro. I look for you hiking through the Bogong High Plains in the valley of the Alps, in the Finnish forests, the restored areas of Overijssel, or the untouched lakes of Kagari, or along the slopes of Cradle Mountain. Sometimes when I find you near the surface, you are only twice my age. However, the deeper we get, the older you become. Sometimes you are 3 times my age, or 10 times my age, sometimes 1,000 times my age. Apparently, in some places, you're even 30 times my age. I guess 99,969 years is a large age gap. But I don't care what anyone says. I love you. And I appreciate all the things you do for this world. I love the things that you do for me. I love you, Pete. Pete, I love you. I love you, Pete. I love you. I love you. I love you. From Tanya Juliet Rebecca Lipman. I'm a PhD candidate at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and I want to give a special thanks to Virginia Vivaldi and all of those in the RE-PEAT collective.
Paleo Peat by Tim Holt Wilson. I picked up a speed camera ticket on my way to Hatfield Moors, though I did not discover that until I got home. The place of my downfall was a hamlet called Sandtoft in the levels of North Lincolnshire. The road was long and straight, crossing a dreary, flat landscape which was once the bed of a glacial meltwater lake some 15,000 years ago. In later millennia, it was a wetland, soused by the River Don, and had expanses of raised bog. This watery situation persisted until the 17th century, when drainage work began to reclaim much of the land for farming. Some primal wilderness did survive into the 20th century on the Hatfield and Thorn Moors, including areas of raised bog. Raised bogs are places where sphagnum moss and other plants have lived and died to produce a mass of water-retentive peat. It may form a giant dome raised several metres above the surrounding countryside. However, these features are vulnerable. Once you start cutting into them in a big way, their waters will gradually drain away and they start subsiding like a pricked balloon. The layers of wet peat dry out and then oxidise, so speeding up the collapse of the bog. This is what happened on the moors in the later 20th century, when they were dug up by a peat extraction company. Many thousands of tons of peat were removed for horticultural use, but at the same time the special peatland wildlife became threatened. Today the extraction has ceased, and efforts are being made to restore the land as part of the Humberhead Peatlands National Nature Reserve. What brought me to Hatfield Moors? An introductory training course on fossil pollen run by Project Wildscape, which aims to investigate the environmental history of the moors. The peat beds are a fossilised archive of thousands of years of rotting vegetation, including microscopic pollen. The aim was to learn to identify the various types and then present the results. Preparing fossil pollen is not an easy process. Advanced laboratory facilities are required, along with dangerous chemicals. Luckily, all the prep work had been done in advance by Wildscape staff using samples extracted by hand coring of peat at a site called Mesick Mere, near Epworth. My fellow students and I were able to use high-powered microscopes set up at a nearby Natural England depot. A magnification of 400 times was needed to see the grains, many of which were distorted and so a bit of a challenge to identify. My first grain was alder, Alnus glutinosa, followed by pine, Pinus sylvestris, and oak, Quercus. See pictures. They were components of the high forest covering drier parts of the moors in mid-Holocene times. Once the pollen had been counted, a very laborious task, and the various percentages of plant types calculated, they could be represented in a pollen diagram. Pollen diagrams are read from bottom upwards, charting the percentages of plant taxa present at successive levels in the peat bog. They can be linked with information from sediment samples to present a vertical profile of environmental changes over time. We can read them, for example, a transition from a lake environment to a reed swamp, or a bog to a carr woodland. This can be compared with what we know of human settlement, or data from other sites in the local area or further afield.
Currently, the majority of the agricultural production in Dutch peat areas is very linear, using monoculture systems that mostly produce dairy. In order to keep this system in place, the soil must be drained, causing desiccation of the soil and thus soil subsidence. This has major impacts on the national and global CO2 emissions and harms local ecosystems. In these systems, there is hardly any connection between farmers and the people. Farmers, however, find themselves trapped in an agricultural system that continues to scale up and is very dependent on global food prices. Therefore, it is time to move instead towards a circular production system, creating resilient ecosystems that can contribute to the climate goals. This can be achieved by moving towards regenerative production methods and diversifying what farmers produce. Restoring the ecosystem, a shift from monoculture production to a combination of dairy production, funding for nature conservation, recreation tours, consultancy, workshops, etc. become possible. This will not only benefit the ecosystem and reduce emissions, but can also allow for more public involvement on the farm, restoring people's connection to farms and their food. The diversification of farming incomes will make farms more resilient and less dependent on global food prices and upscaling.
Protecting peat space. Peat has always been known for its wonderful and versatile properties. During the Middle Ages in the fenlands of Lincolnshire, it was cut for fuel. Not just everyday fuel, as it was prized and expensive. It was notoriously exploited, and its price was regulated mainly by the fenland monasteries. For example, in the 15th century, the Abbot of Crowland issued strict regulations for the cutting, carting and selling of peat. One of its major uses was for firing pottery kilns in a thriving local industry. That was because it could build up and maintain a steady and reliable heat. Apart from fuel, the rich peaty fenland supported a combination of marshland, grazing and pastoral farming, and abundant watery harvests of fish, fowl, reeds, rushes and sedge. Conversely, peat's ability to absorb water was often troublesome. So for an early date, there were already diversions, dikes and cut-off channels for the rivers to enable the development of arable farming. In spite of drainage, the River Witham was constantly flooding, such that in the 1320s there was widespread local famine. Crops could not survive the inundation and waterlogging, and agricultural land was lost. Bigger changes began in the mid-17th century and continued into the 19th century. In the face of much local opposition and protest, groups of investors were given incentives to clear and drain the land. So that is when Dutch engineer Cornelius Vermuyden was employed to devise a series of reservoirs, sluices, channels, dikes and wind pumps to drain the land systematically. The value of drained peat as a fertile agricultural resource was increasingly monetized. He was followed 2 centuries later by British engineer John Rennie and his successors' networks of more cut-off channels, locks, dams, embankments and pumping stations, 286 of them over 1,500 square miles. Now, the role of the Environment Agency and the Internal Drainage Board is to maintain and improve on all of this historic legacy, to continue to protect agricultural land and homes. However, this land needs much more than maintenance. It needs an entire change of attitude, away from commodification and towards regeneration. A capitalist economy does not suit this fragile terrain. While the drained fenland peat has made a fertile and profitable arable growing medium, we now know so much more about the real costs to the environment. Views are beginning to change and need to change much more. Drained peat is easily washed or blown away, especially as the fenland fields have almost no boundary hedges. The consequent danger of soil runoff and increasing soil impoverishment and desertification has been known about and criticised, at least since the 1970s. The leaching of oil and agrochemicals into the extensive network of water channels has had a devastating effect on aquatic life and on wildlife in general. As we head towards increasing effects of climate change, this is only now becoming widely recognised as a huge problem. But one of the most enormous problems peat causes in its dry state is that it is a major source of greenhouse gas. As a result of the extent of local arable farming on drained peat, the Borough Council of Kings Lynn and West Norfolk has some of the highest carbon emissions in the country. We now know that properly managed, this can be reversed. Wet peat can be a valuable asset as a carbon store, better than forests. Even as the fenlands produce 33% of Britain's food, many farmers now recognise that practices need to change. Agriculture has to adapt in order that peatlands can be regenerated to something like their natural state, absorbing water once again. Some farmers are even now saying they're no longer prepared to sacrifice the environment to profit. Creative thinking, innovation and technology can help. Research programs and field trials under the auspices of long-term projects like the Great Fen are underway to find solutions. Communities like the Ouse Washes Landscape Partnership are actively looking for ways in which they can work in sympathy with the land rather than continuing to fight its natural properties. The EU has to promote this attitude and support these innovations and find more. Protecting green space is widely recognised as an environmental goal. Protecting peat space has to go alongside that.
The mission of our time was successful. We are not hungry anymore. We load our shopping carts for little money, but secretly we pay a different price. We no longer feel a connection with the landscape that surrounds us. We peered across the country. A half-heavy vanilla dangled from the bird connoisseur's lower lip. We saw lapwings. We saw a hare on high, stiff legs, challenging a buzzard that had probably landed too close to its young. We discovered everything, and I was thrilled. I didn't watch Planet Earth on television. I watched the countryside with someone who sighed "machtig mooi" all the time. We were first rank in a Dutch agricultural cultural landscape that vibrated with life. By Jantien de Boer, in the book Landschapspijn. The peat meadow landscape is one of the most valuable and characteristic landscapes of the Netherlands. The open polder landscape with the narrow lots is typical of peat meadow areas. Cultural historical elements and structures, like windmills, have been well preserved. Dairy cattle have been kept in the polder for centuries. However, the intensification of farming activities, systemic drainage and dewatering have put the landscape under threat. Veeland wants to turn this around, creating a landscape that is becoming healthier each day, with the knowledge and ecological quality of before, but with the techniques of the future. With balanced soils, meadows and water bodies full of life, extensive grazing, new types of land use, and happy farmers.
Let me introduce myself. I'm Peat, an organic soil from the north of Scotland. I'm about 55% organic carbon in my natural state and about 90% water. Nobody thought much of me for many decades, centuries, or even millennia. Although I was a useful and sustainable fuel source for the locals, I was of little use for agriculture. Then around the middle of the 20th century, there was an incentive scheme to drain me so I'd be more productive for agriculture. Many pretty patterns of drain appeared on my surface, and some people even tried to grow grass on me. Both were to little avail, and I continued to the butt of jokes of many farmers and crofters. Around this time, I was also considered very useful fuel source, and I was literally taken away and burnt to produce electricity. However, I was grateful that I live a long way away from the centres of population, and I'm very expensive to dry and transport. This didn't really take off, certainly not to the extent of my relatives further south. Shortly after this, a number of tree species from overseas, notably North America, started to appear in the UK, and it was thought that they didn't bother that I was wet, acidic, and with a low level of nutrients. I honestly thought planting trees on me was quite a good idea at the time. It would create jobs for the local population and stop me being the butt of so many jokes. A lot of it was funded through a craftily assembled tax regime, and I had even had famous singers and snooker players throwing money at me. I was flat, stone-free, and a plough could go through me easily. The sky was the limit. Alas, being planted with trees created a number of problems, for the internationally important bird species and large areas of habitat were replaced by large areas of non-native trees. After much debate and squabbling, tree planting was banned over large areas of me, especially if I was over a metre deep and was covered in large areas of smagma. This pleased a large number of people, interestingly most of whom lived at some distance from where I live. I found this odd. But it was also starting to emerge that our climate is changing, by too much of certain gases being pumped into our atmosphere. And some of it was coming from me. All these trees and drainage had dried me out, and I was spewing out carbon dioxide. Something had to be done. I had to start getting that carbon back in. It was also becoming apparent that the trees were not growing very well, very misshapen and slowly growing. So blow me down, folk came along, took the trees away and started to block all the drains. I am now recovering, but it will take some time for me to get back to my full strength. So you will see, I have had quite an interesting life. Wind turbines are starting to appear, but this is probably on the whole a good thing. They are appearing mostly on areas where I have already been damaged. Renewable is a good word, in the same way as being renewed in order to get my carbon back. It is now being suggested that I become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that should mean that I should be immune from all these activities that I described above. I just want to be a peat bog again, holding my carbon, providing a valuable habitat, a record of past climates and vegetation, and providing an overwhelming sense of space and peace. I think that this time people need a lot more of these. By Willie Towers, soil scientist.
Dear members of the European Parliament, in the defense of the planet against the climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity and the declining availability of clean water, the preservation of wetlands plays a vital role. When it comes to the climate, they sequester and store CO2 from the atmosphere and thus contribute directly to global cooling. All efforts to reduce emissions to the atmosphere, essential as they are, will not solve the climate problem, which is determined by the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. As CO2 stays for hundreds of years in the atmosphere and will thus perpetuate the climate crisis, even if all emissions would be zero today, it is of the greatest importance to lower the concentration. Again, that is what wetlands do, and without them there is no chance we can win the fight against the life-threatening impacts of climate change. Peatlands are one of the categories of wetlands, which are of the essence in the process of global cooling, and here the EU, as the largest trading bloc in the world, has a major responsibility. Wouter Wiening, Chairman President, Institute for Environmental Security, Headquarters The Hague, Netherlands. www.envirosecurity.org